A real incident room isn't anything like the ones you see on TV in crime dramas. There are no whiteboards, no pictures of the victim and suspects pinned up, and no frantically scribbled lines to connect the evidence. It's actually a very calm place at the eye of the storm of the crime and the investigation. The only furniture is a very long table that seats about 20 people. Chairs are reserved for the detective inspector leading the investigation and for the incident room team. But for everyone else, it's first come, first seated. If you come late, you stand by the wall. The Incident Room Murder Conference is a place to describe and discuss, and you do not speak unless you're spoken to, especially if you're a buckshee. A buckshee is a slang word meaning free of charge, and is usually referred to a plainclothes junior member of the investigating team. The DI leads the proceedings, recording everything in the jobs book. This is the Bible of the investigation, listing every job to be undertaken, with the name beside each one. As each job is completed, it's marked. They are key roles to be filled for every murder investigation, including crime scene mapper, crime photographer, scenes of crime officer, exhibits officer, family liaison officer, press officer, and technical analysts for CCTV and phones. The incident room is where all the information and evidence is gathered, shared, dissected, and evaluated. In any incident room, the victim becomes very real to the investigators because they pore over every detail about them that they can find. It is during this process that the Gardaí realise and understand the strange relationship between victim and investigator, how one comes to regard them as very real, very alive, even though you know them only in death. One of these victims was a woman named Marilyn Rynn, and it was the first murder case Detective Inspector Pat Murray ever investigated as part of a team. As the information started to come into the incident room from the various lines of inquiry, a very clear picture of who she was emerged. Marilyn was an independent woman. She never married and was 41 years old. She was very happy in her own company and living alone, but also a great friend, sister, aunt and daughter. She loved gardening and keep fit and worked for the Department of the Environment in the National Roads Authority section, where she was a respected and much loved colleague. It seemed that everyone who had met Marilyn enjoyed her good humour, her work ethic, her reliability and her great zest for life. She was 5'5" tall, with short brown hair, brown eyes, and of slim build. She lived around the corner from her brother in Brookhaven Drive in Blanchardstown in County Dublin. Marilyn was like a second mother to her nieces and nephew. By the time she would lose her life, they were 18, 16, and 11 years of age, and she would have watched them all grow up, as not only did she see them for family occasions, but she spent a great deal of time babysitting them. In the run-up to Christmas of 1995, Marilyn had a busy week. Before finishing work, she had last-minute shopping to do, and her social calendar was full. On Monday, the 18th of December, Marilyn had dinner with her brother Stephen and his wife Catherine and their children. Marilyn was very close to her sister-in-law. She had even made Marilyn a cake to celebrate her 41st birthday, which she had turned that week. The following Tuesday, Marilyn had lunch with her work colleagues, and then on the Wednesday, she met up with Catherine once more to wrap presents and chat about their plans for Christmas week. After work on Thursday, Marilyn had her work Christmas party and planned to meet a friend on the Friday evening. As for Christmas Day, her plans were as always, since moving out of the family home in Ballyfermot in Dublin. She would spend the night with her parents on Christmas Eve and spend the day with them on Christmas Day. On Thursday, the 21st of December 1995, Marilyn went to work as usual on Waterloo Road, and afterwards went to a pub on Tara Street with her friend, where they would meet up with other work colleagues for drinks before going to the Old Sheeling Hotel on the Hoth Road in Raheny. On a lighter note, this is the hotel car park where Sharon Curley's unfortunate encounter took place with Mr. Burgess in the movie The Snapper. Those of you who have seen the movie will recognise it, and those of you who haven't, it is well worth a watch. Here at this hotel, Marilyn and her work colleagues descended for dinner, drinks and dancing. Marilyn was in great form, and by the time the music was over at 1 a.m, her and a colleague walked to a taxi rank. Marilyn was hoping to meet up with former colleagues she had worked with in 1993. She was one of the few from the party that had left on her own when the night in the hotel was over. Marilyn was last seen at Eddie Rocket's diner on O'Connell Street in the city centre by her former colleagues. They all had been in there having something to eat and a catch-up. As she left, she told her friends that she was getting the last Nightlink bus from Westmoreland Street to Blanchardstown, which left at 3 a.m. Marilyn was due at work the next morning. It was the last day of work before the Christmas break, but no one was particularly concerned when she didn't show up. As usual, after a Christmas party, there would be very few in. Even though they didn't know Marilyn to be the type to be late or miss work, they cut her a little slack because of this. They did, however, ring her home around mid-morning, but there was no answer, and it was assumed she had slept in. As Marilyn's family knew she had a very busy schedule, it wouldn't be until Christmas Eve that they thought something might be wrong. They too couldn't get in touch with her. Her brother Stephen called to her house Christmas Eve to pick her up to bring her to their parents' house in Ballyfermot. But she wasn't home. She didn't turn up later that night, and she wasn't at Mass the next morning, which was a family tradition that the whole family would attend Mass together. On St. Stephen's Day, Marilyn's brother called to her house once more, and still there was no sign of her. They phoned friends and colleagues to see if they could find out where she had got to. No one had heard or seen her since Thursday the 21st. It was then that Stephen, her brother, went to Blanchardstown Garda Station and reported her missing. It was now 5 days since Marilyn had been seen. Garda inquiries began straight away, and officers were dispatched into Marilyn's neighbourhood to see when neighbours saw her last. A 13-year-old boy said he had seen her on Friday the 22nd, the morning after the Christmas party. He said he had seen her leave her house and walk to the nearby bus stop, and speak to his sister, who was also waiting at the bus stop. So it was thought that Marilyn had boarded the number 38 bus at around 12:30 p.m. Another neighbour said she had seen Marilyn in Blanchardstown village. A friend the Gardaí had contacted told them that she had spoken to Marilyn on the phone the morning of Friday the 22nd, and they had made plans to meet at the Longhall pub later that day, but she never arrived. With the investigation, the Gardaí were able to establish that Marilyn did get her last bus to Blanchardstown on the morning of the 22nd and was dropped off at around 3:30 a.m. Marilyn then headed off on foot towards her home. No money had been taken out of Marilyn's bank account since the 20th of December, the day before the Christmas party. Her passport and all her belongings were found at the house. Presents were left beneath her Christmas tree. It was established through friends and family that it was very unlike Marilyn not to be in contact. Her brother would say she was in perfect health and had no money worries. There was no reason for her to just disappear. A neat stack of Christmas cards had been found on her hall table. They had been delivered on the 22nd of December, the last day for Christmas post. At first, Gardaí thought that Marilyn had stacked them, and therefore eyewitnesses stating they had seen her leave her house that morning must be true. But later it would be learned that it was one of her nieces that had called to the house and picked up the Christmas cards and left them on the table. On Saturday, the 30th of December, a body of a woman was found on Dollymount Strand. There were a number of missing women over that period, and Gardaí were anxious to identify the body quickly. One of these women was a young woman in her 20s who had gone missing from Portmarnock, and of course you had Jojo Dollard from Kilkenny, had also gone missing on her way home from Dublin that previous November. At the time, there was no centralised computer database, and so the Gardaí were not sharing or making connections of missing persons or unsolved murders like they could have been. The woman found on the beach was later identified as 25-year-old Denise Spires. She had been missing for 2 weeks, and the family had said she had been in need of medical assistance for her depression. God love her and her family. Gardaí at this stage were reviewing all the information that had come in, including witness statements, especially the ones that came from the people who said they saw or spoke to Marilyn that morning of Friday the 22nd of December. The clothes that were described she was wearing at the Christmas party were also described by witnesses the next day. But if Marilyn had been home, she would not have gone out in the same clothes again. Gardaí were convinced that the witnesses did not see Marilyn that morning, that they were mistaken about which day they had seen her. The Gardaí decided to concentrate their search in the Blanchardstown area. They knew Marilyn had got the Nightlink bus and then had a short walk home, which would bring her to the area known as the Tulka Valley Regional Park. They thought that it being so late that Marilyn might have taken a shortcut through the park from Blanchardstown village to where she lived on the far side. If she had taken the long way home, it would have added 20 minutes to her journey. The shortcut would have been dense with trees and foliage. It was a popular shortcut for the residents that lived on either side of the park, but it would have been a lonely spot at that time of the morning, and unsavoury characters would frequent the park, especially at that time. While neither of the options would have been deemed safe, and a taxi home would have been a better option, Marilyn, as I said before, was a fiercely independent woman, and the personality to not shy away from situations or fear them. When they searched the park, they brought in dogs to help, and just 15 minutes into the search, one of the dogs alerted, and a naked body of a woman had been found, lying face down under some brambles. It was Marilyn. Her clothes and handbag were found nearby. Marilyn was still wearing her jewellery, and her handbag contained £200 in cash, her ID and bank cards. The crime scene was cordoned off, and the state pathologist Dr. Harbison was called to the scene. Marilyn was found just 5 minutes from her home. The body was then removed to Connolly's Hospital in Blanchardstown for post-mortem. The state pathologist felt that Marilyn had been killed where she was found or close by. The post-mortem showed that she had been raped and strangled, and she most likely was killed the morning of the 22nd of December. When the Gardaí had examined her house in the previous weeks, it showed no sign of a struggle. These findings put into question her friend saying she had spoken to Marilyn on the morning of the 22nd, and her saying they were to meet later that day. When questioned by detectives, the friend was adamant that she had her timeline right, even when she was presented with evidence to prove that she was mistaken. Detective Inspector Pat Murray said in his book, "Beware of the witnesses with a desire to help. It's an odd aspect of dead body effect, this wanting to be useful to the point of giving false information. You'll get a witness who is 100% certain they saw something significant, when they saw nothing of the sort at all. But it isn't lying, it's more like a false memory that comes out of their need to be helpful and to be seen as helpful. Or it's a desire to be important to the investigation, to be a key witness." Marilyn's funeral took place on the 9th of January at St. Matthew's Church, Ballyfermot, near where she had grown up and where her parents still lived. Hundreds of people packed into the church to pay their respects to the woman who was so into sport and who was generous with her time, even helping out at the local Girl Guides where both her nieces were members. Her parents, her sister and brother were devastated at the loss of their beloved Marilyn. In the meantime, door-to-door inquiries were done again in the housing estates near to the park. Some reported hearing screams on the morning of the 22nd of December, but put it down to people coming home drunk from a night out, or the hangabouts that frequented the park late at night. Gardaí were compiling a list of men from the area of Tulka Park and beyond who had a criminal history of violence and sexual assaults. CCTV footage was gathered, but there was no sign of Marilyn in any collected. The Nightline bus footage could not be recovered as they had been wiped. it was standard that they wiped the tapes every 3 to 4 days. This would leave them to rely on forensic evidence in order to progress the case. The Forensic Science Laboratory in Dublin introduced DNA technology for Garda investigations in 1994. It was a new science at the time, but the team were aware of its potential to provide rock-solid evidence. Dr. Harbison had taken samples from the body at the scene, and from these he had identified traces of semen. Based on this, the lead detective decided to get buccal swabs from a wide range of men to compare against the DNA of the semen found in Marilyn's body. The team secured 350 samples for DNA testing, including 100 from men with known histories of sexual assault. These samples, though, could only be held for 6 months. Otherwise, they had to be destroyed under the Criminal Justice Forensic Act of 1990 if a charge wasn't secured. On the 15th of January, a reconstruction of Marilyn's last known movements was televised, asking the public for help. There was a flurry of calls to the hotline. Some had leads and some just wanted to vent and express their outrage that a woman could be murdered so close to her home after a night out. It was reported that the Gardaí had a list of 11 suspects, and they said the list was getting smaller, but they were still no closer to having a prime suspect. The Gardaí had hit a wall. In March of 1996, they were to start all over again, looking at all the evidence that had been collected. House-to-house inquiries were once more done and questionnaires were handed out. A photo fit was issued after Gardaí had spoken to a woman who was on the Nightlink bus the night of the 22nd of December. She had fallen asleep on the bus and she woke to a man groping her. He wouldn't leave her alone and he followed her off the bus until she waved at a stranger and pretended that he was her boyfriend, which saved her. 2,500 people were interviewed and 1,000 statements were taken. Some of these statements had people admitting that they were in or around the area at the time Marilyn was attacked and murdered. While reviewing what some people had said, they looked for inconsistencies, and one man stood out to them. He had said he had been in Blanchardstown that night and had walked through the park, but hadn't seen Marilyn, but did describe seeing a jogger in the park, which nobody else did. He also told Gardaí that he got home around 4:50 a.m, but was spotted, according to a neighbour, coming home at around 3:45 a.m. At this stage, they included this man in providing a DNA sample, which he did. On Tuesday, the 6th of August 1996, 8 months after Marilyn was raped and murdered, an arrest was made. A match had been identified. It was 32-year-old David Lawler. He was one of 350 men who gave samples. Lawler was arrested at his home in Blanchardstown as he was leaving for work. He was married with one child and another on the way. He is originally from Baltinglass in County Wicklow and had a good job working as a technician for Telecom Éireann. He, by chance, had gone to school with Larry Murphy, aka the Beast of Baltinglass, who would go on to kidnap, rape and attempt to murder a young woman from Carlow in 2000, and is suspected to be involved in the disappearance of other missing women of the 90s, called the Vanishing Triangle. After the DNA match, Gardaí decided to monitor Lawler. He was known as a strange character in the area, and his long ponytail set him apart. He was nicknamed Jesus because of his long scraggly hair and beard. He was known as a big drinker, which led him to not turn up for work for days when he went on long binges. His internet searches were also investigated, and it was said that he had spent hundreds of pounds accessing premium porn sites. It was also revealed that he had done internet searches on DNA tests. He had read that semen can only last 14 days in the open air, at which point DNA can no longer be identified. Marilyn's body was found 15 days after the crime, and so Lawler was only too happy to cooperate and provide a sample, because he felt safe in the knowledge that the DNA evidence would be too degraded to use. But what he didn't consider was how cold it was that December, and when poor Marilyn was found, she was frozen, and so was the semen, and therefore preserving the evidence, and so a viable DNA sample was extracted, which led to the match and the arrest. When Lawler was confronted, he folded straight away, and this was his story. On the 21st of December 1995, Lawler went to the Telecom Éireann Christmas lunch. He drank and partied for the next 12 hours, then headed off on foot. He had originally told Gardaí that there were no taxis, so he decided to walk home to Blanchardstown. Later, he confessed that he had walked to Benburb Street, a popular spot for sex workers. It was a very busy night though, with so many Christmas revellers around, and the sex workers were as busy as the taxi men, so Lawler couldn't find anyone to hook up with. He continued on his way, walking the 5 miles to Blanchardstown. When he was almost home, a Nightlink bus pulled up, and a lone woman got out and began walking ahead of him towards the tunnels. He trailed her, and in the shadows of the underground pass, he attacked her. He dragged her off into the bushes, forced her to remove her clothes, and raped her. He would say Marilyn got a good look at him as she tried to fight him off, and she indicated that she recognised him from the area. This was easy to do with his long hair and beard. This is why he said he killed her, along with an uncontrollable urge that he acted on. This was a man with no prior convictions, not known to the Gardaí, with a stable home and a wife and a young child. So Detective Inspector Pat Marry would say what he did next is mind-boggling. There, on the cold wet ground, he put his bare hands around Marilyn's neck, and he squeezed relentlessly. But she was lying on her stomach, and he couldn't get a proper grip. He flipped her over, dug his thumbs into the tender spot at her throat, and strangled her, until her body stopped moving. She was dead. Then he stood up, walked home, and got into bed beside his wife. The next day he went to work and continued his life, as if nothing at all happened. When the Gardaí came knocking on his door, he calmly told lies also. For the investigating team, this was a dream confession, corroborating all they had already and explaining everything they didn't. This doesn't happen very often in a murder case. Lawler was remanded in custody after being formally charged. However, the following week, on Tuesday, the 13th of August 1996, he was granted bail on consent by the DPP. His brother provided surety, and Lawler was released to his parents' house in Baltinglass in Wicklow. The book of evidence was presented in February of 1997, and it contained over 1,000 statements. In January of 1998, the trial was ready to begin if Lawler withdrew his guilty plea. This did not happen. He pleaded guilty to the rape and murder of Marilyn. The facts of the case were read briefly to the court. The defence on behalf of Lawler expressed his deepest sorrow and regret for what he had done, and that he was deeply sorry for the loss and stress he had caused to the Rynn family. Lawler was sentenced to life in prison. After the hearing, Marilyn's brother Stephen spoke briefly to the press waiting outside the court. He said they were glad it was over, but nothing could bring Marilyn back. It had been a difficult 2 years. Christina Rynn, Marilyn's 78-year-old mother, said she would never forgive Lawler for what he had done, and said she might as well be honest and said Lawler deserves to be hanged. She went on to call him a coward. When Lawler was in prison and Larry Murphy was imprisoned in 2001 in the same prison, they struck up a friendship. Murphy was sentenced to 15 years for his crime, but only served 10 years. After Murphy got out, Gardaí went to Lawler to see if he had any information on other crimes Murphy might have committed. Despite widespread use of DNA in court cases, a DNA database was not established until 2014 in Ireland. This also included new legislation which allowed Gardaí to hold and store DNA profiles for longer than 6 months from people who had committed certain crimes or who had been detained for certain crimes. In 2014, the website The Wicklow News reported that Lawler was to be released that year, But in 2018, he was still in prison. He had been moved from Arbour Hill, which is a sex offenders only prison. He was being moved in order to accommodate new prisoners there. It's been 26 years this January 2024 since Lawler was sentenced. The average life sentence at push is 18 years, so it's safe to say Lawler is walking amongst us, and women of Ireland should be worried wherever he is.